Right, so every year there is an outcry about a lack of student accommodation, a shortfall of beds. So ahead of the academic year, we're looking at how bad the situation is and what the options are. We did try to speak to NSFAS, that of course provides funding for accommodation, but it said it doesn't actually deal with the accommodation, with the number of beds. That is under the purview of the universities themselves, but NSFAS only offers the funding. So let's get a perspective from Respublica of Student Living. The CEO Craig McMurray joins us, and they of course provide and own and develop student facilities. Welcome to you, Craig.
Good morning, Francis.
Firstly, tell me how bad the situation is, if you can gauge.
Sure. I think that the dire shortage of accommodation is something that's very well publicised, both within the South African public, government and the university and institutions are well aware of it. With an increasing enrolment, with the onslaught of free education and training, that problem is only going to be exacerbated. So we can quantify it in hundreds of thousands, but the problem is, regardless of how big it is, it's not getting any better.
If we say hundreds of thousands, 300,000, something like that.
There's a lot of numbers that have been bantered about, but the reality is that there's approximately 1.2 million students in higher education universities. One often forgets and neglects all the students who are staying at TVETs, and that enrollment is growing at a far faster rate than universities. So if you add TVETs into the equation, the number is probably closer to 500,000 in terms of the shortage in our view.
But a great business opportunity.
It is a business opportunity, but I think one must differentiate between a demand and the ability to pay, so in other words, affordability.
Well, let's discuss that, because business gets involved when universities can't provide the beds. Sometimes they're accused of ripping off students because that demand is so high. Can you give us an idea of how you can bring that surcharge in?
Well, I think that firstly there has to be a realization from all the role players about what student accommodation costs, and I'm talking about building costs as well as operating costs. Once that reality is well understood, then one can look at how do you solve for the problem. Because as long as there's a gap between what the perceived cost of student accommodation is and also what it entails and what type of funding is necessary, then you're not going to solve the problem.
Is there a major gap?
There is a major gap. I think that if you look at some type of yardsticks, for example, NSFAS's allocation to the accommodation portion of their funding. Firstly, it's not consistent. So there isn't a fixed amount that any student can get allocated regardless of where they go and study.
Is there an average? How much generally does
There isn't an average. We often get asked this question. It varies from university to university.
3,000,
it can vary
1,
anywhere, from, in our experience again, anywhere from as low as 2,000 up to 4,600 Rand a month. And that is largely a function of how the university gets allocated funds centrally from NSFAS and how they decide to actually allocate at a per student level and distribute those funds.
But then say Braamfontein, so Wits and UJ cannot accommodate all the students, they spill over into Braamfontein, there's great demand there. What's your sort of entry level cost?
Well, at Respublica, again, one has to actually compare apples with apples. So you get accommodation. I mean, the reality is that everyone's sleeping somewhere.
You don't have to give your entry level. Just give me
quite happy to give it. In our case, we range anywhere from 3,400 right up to 7,600. But it's like asking, what's the price of an airline ticket? Are you booking economy, business, or first class? You can get on the same airplane, but you're choosing a different seat. And in Respublica, we have a diversified offering in all of our facilities. So depending on a student's level of affordability and the level of privacy or exclusivity they want, they can choose a different product within the same facility.
So that NSFAS rate will at least help them to get into...
It will. At certain universities, it funds at 100%, and at other universities, because of the way they fund it and the amount that they're actually receiving, they have to top up.
Could you give us an idea, so Wits, UJ, how many beds and how many students? Do you have any idea there?
I can give you a view at a national level, because it does vary across all the institutions, as I say. But on average, none of our universities are providing much more than 10% of the enrolled student population with on-campus accommodation. So if you assume that we've got about 1.2 million students, of which only about 1 million are full-time enrolled, and of those full-time enrolled, you need to exclude maybe all of the all of the students who are not staying at one of the 23 institutions, then you're probably looking at about 700,000 students that need to be housed. There's only about 130 to 140,000 on-campus beds, which mean all the rest need to either be staying in private accommodation and purpose-built facilities, which in itself is a different definition, or be staying at home.
And so 10%, is that a lack of incentive for universities to do it? I mean, give me your opinion. What is government's role here? What is the university's role?
Firstly, you've had a massive growth in enrollments. Between 2010 and 2016, when the last official numbers were surveyed, you had about a 36% growth in enrollment. And in that time, very little increase in student accommodation on campus. You've seen a big reduction in the contribution from government to those higher education institutions as far as funding is concerned. So not only do they have a low capacity that is not growing in line with the enrollment growth, but they also have aged, obsolete and old resident stock that has not been maintained. And so that now compounds into the problem that we find today.
So heading towards fee-free education, the universities have said they will have less, so they're not going to go out and build more hostel accommodation.
The university got many challenges. In order to facilitate and to accommodate the increase in enrollments, they have to increase the physical infrastructure on the campus as far as lecture halls and theatres and research infrastructure is concerned, as well as the student accommodation component of it. So the spend that's required in order for them to accommodate this new growth is quite substantial. And you're actually seeing the inverse. You're seeing a lot of universities having a reduction in the funding that they were getting from government previously.
And there's no legal requirements of how many beds to students or anything like that?
I can't talk for the institutions. I know obviously that the Department of Higher Education is encouraging universities to prioritise the accommodation for first-year students when they're most needy and they need the most support.
And then the private sector, so what can companies like you do? Give us your experience. What can other private companies do?
So the private sector has been involved in student accommodation for quite some time. If you have a look at what's happened with the industry internationally, it was an alternative asset class that's now matured to the extent that a lot of the major institutions, pension funds, sovereign funds, have put a lot of capital into student accommodation. It's very well matured in the US. It's very well matured now in the UK, and Australia and other geographies are also now getting that level of maturity, which means that there's a flow of capital to it. In South Africa, it's slightly different in that we rely more on domestic students rather than international students, which have really fueled the growth in the international markets. But in the fact that we are accommodating domestic students and there's such a low level of affordability, from a return point of view, it is not what one hears in the hairdresser talk about being a high yield, high return game. It is the exact opposite. So you get very comparable yields to what you get in conventional property types, be it retail, commercial or industrial, except there's a much higher level of operational intensity, of risk, and significantly higher operating costs. Conventional property, such as that you see in the listed funds, will operate around about a 50% ops cost, 15% ops cost ratio. If you're running a reputable and fully fledged student operation, you are gravitating between 35 and 60% ops costs, which means you can't afford to have vacancies and you don't have the luxury of long-term leases. It is literally month on month, and your tenant is a tenant who does not earn any money. They're a student. So the risk
sometimes ransacks your place.
It can be if it's not well managed, but I think there's ways of managing that. But at the end of the day, it's a high-risk game with very comparable margins to what one gets in conventional property. So if you want to attract capital, you need all the players to come to the party in order to attract it.
Quick advice for students out there who want to get the best, most affordable accommodation.
I think the first thing is always just start early. Don't leave it to January when you find that 40 to 50% of the students actually start looking for accommodation. Do it as early as possible so that you can find the best operators, the most reputable accommodation, and then check with the university. Make sure that that operator is either accredited or recommended by the university. If you can, visit the site. And the most important thing is understand what's included, because you need to compare apples with apples. In the case of Respublica, everything is included, and that includes your accommodation, free uncapped Wi-Fi, your laundry, a room clean, parking, all the facilities. There's no additional cost, whereas often what one sees and a student will see advertised will be the base cost, and there are a lot of add-ons, including all your utilities, which means that that cost can at least double in certain cases.
All right, thank you very much. That was Craig McMurray, CEO of Respublica of Student Living.